All right, ladies and gentlemen, week 15 of the 2024 fantasy football season is in the books, and we're headed straight into week 16 of the fantasy season and the second round of the fantasy playoffs. So, you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, talk about every single wide receiver, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting in week 16. Let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We're going to have the Broncos traveling to face the Chargers. Let's start with the Broncos side of things. Courtland Sutton continues to give you a very safe floor, be very consistent overall. A little bit of a lower ceiling this past week. 12.2 fantasy points. A little disappointing because he did have 9 targets, but just 3 catches, 32 receiving yards. Luckily scored a touchdown. Bo Nix a little bit off in week 15. I think he'll bounce back here in week 16 and the following week against Cincinnati in week 17. So if you own Courtland Sutton, don't stress out here. Still a top 15 wide receiver in fantasy football. Very, very safe. Double digits in every game since week 8. So you own Courtland Sutton, keep rolling with him. Anybody else here, it's just way too risky. We've seen some sporadic volume to Marvin Mims and Troy Franklin and Devon Vele, but no consistency whatsoever. So not looking to start any other Broncos wide receiver, and none of them really need to be rostered at this point, in my opinion. And if you're worried about this matchup for Sutton, by the way, the last time he played the Chargers, he had a touchdown and 15.3 fantasy points. And this Chargers defense, I've been saying it for a couple weeks now, they've been pretty wishy-washy. Like, they just haven't been as good as of late. So I'm not worried about this matchup for Courtland Sutton. Looking at the Chargers wide receivers, they had a very nice opportunity against a bad Buccaneers defense in week 15. Ladd McConkey, who almost did not play, did play. He had 16.8 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 catches, 58 receiving yards, and a touchdown. You own Ladd McConkey. Tough matchup on paper, but worth noting that Pat Surtain got a little bit banged up in the fourth quarter of the Broncos-Colts game last week. So we'll see what he's looking like going into this week. And the Broncos secondary is a little bit banged up right now. So I'm not too worried about Ladd McConkey, although if he draws Pat Surtain, it's definitely a stiff matchup. But he's been fantastic. His last 4 starts, he has 14.3 or more fantasy points. Obviously, it was a good matchup against the Bucs this past week, but if you own Ladd McConkey, I'm still rolling with him. Quentin Johnston, I do think, is flexible. Like, you break down QJ since week 9, right? He had the dud against Baltimore. It was bad, right? 5 targets, 0 catches. The following week, in a good matchup against the Falcons, it was bad, just 3.2 fantasy points, but every other game, he has a touchdown or 12.8 or more fantasy points. I mean, double digits in every game since week 9. So, he's been good, and he had those 2 really good games early on in the season as well. So I know it's tough to trust Quentin Johnston, but I think he still remains in that flexible category. Desperation flex, a little bit of a lower tier in terms of flex options because I understand the trust issues, but you look at the numbers, he's been producing, and he had a nice game with 15.5 fantasy points this past week, but it is worth noting he's dealing with an ankle injury going into the week. Josh Palmer saw some additional volume week 14 with no Ladd McConkey, then came back to earth this past week with Ladd McConkey on the field, just 3 fantasy points. So we'll see what happens in this one. First game of the week, and we definitely have some startable wide receivers in this week 16 matchup. All right, let's move into Saturday's action. We're going to get 2 games on Saturday. The early game is going to be the Texans traveling to face the Chiefs. Let's start with Nico Collins, who you just have to keep rolling with. 17.7 fantasy points in week 15. Basically did everything for the Texans in this game and did it off of just 6 targets, 4 grabs, 17 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. I mean, there's just not enough involvement for anybody else on this roster. Tank Dell had 2 catches. Xavier Hutchinson had 1 catch. Dalton Schultz had 2 catches off of 4 targets. Joe Mixon didn't do a whole lot this past week, but did have 6 targets and 5 catches. So when it comes to the receiver position, it's all Nico Collins, right? The 2 receiving touchdowns. I mean, low scoring game, kind of surprising. But almost all of it went to Nico Collins, right? So Yes, it's a tough matchup on paper, but the Chiefs secondary hasn't been as good as of late. They're a little bit banged up. Nothing to worry about here. I don't think I need to convince you guys to start Nico Collins. If you got him, keep rolling with him. Anybody else on this roster, just not worth the fantasy start. Let's take a look at the Chiefs wide receivers, and we're either going to have Patrick Mahomes play this week or not have Patrick Mahomes play this week. So he's considered week to week with a high ankle sprain. If it's Mahomes, I think Hopkins and Worthy are definitely flexible. Hopkins, lower game this past week, 8.6 fantasy points after having 13 or more in 3 straight games. Xavier Worthy had himself a nice game with 19.6 fantasy points. So these guys just kind of live in the flex area. And I do think like they could be okay if Carson Wentz gets to start at quarterback, but their upside's a bit lowered for sure. So startable, but kind of depends on the quarterback situation and what other options you have. The Texans secondary surprised me this past week, but ultimately they've been pretty bad on the season as a whole. So there should be opportunity, really, regardless of the quarterback situation here for Hopkins or Worthy. I don't think any other Chiefs wide receiver is worth starting, but I do want to mention that Hollywood Brown may be activated this week and may get his first start in the season. And although it is a good matchup, and we talked about him in the waiver video, he's nothing but a desperation start because we just don't know what type of volume we're going to get here. So, don't get too cute here. If you pick up Hollywood Brown, don't start him this week. First game back from injury, essentially a season-ending injury, and he's may be getting activated. We don't know yet. And we're not going to start him in the second round of the fantasy playoffs. No, thank you. All right, the afternoon game on Saturday will be the Steelers traveling to face the Ravens. George Pickens has missed the last 2 weeks with a hamstring injury, and I've talked about this over the past 2 weeks. I am really worried about George Pickens if I own George Pickens, okay? Because what I've read is that this is the same level of hamstring injury that kept Mike Evans out for 4 weeks, and that would put Pickens out for the remainder of the fantasy season, right? Exactly 4 games. So I don't know if Pickens going to play this week or not. I think he is startable if he plays. It's a good matchup against the Ravens. This is going to be a competitive game. Both these teams are going to do whatever they can to win this game. Playoff implications for both teams here. So sure, if Pickens plays, you can fire him up, but I just don't know what we're going to get this weekend if he's going to play or not. In terms of anybody else on this roster, I know that Calvin Austin had a nice week this past week, but he's just been way too inconsistent. Did nothing in week 14. Showed up this past week, was nice the 2 weeks before. So we already tried to do this, called him a sneaky start and everything, and he didn't show up. So he might be a sneaky start this week, but I don't want you guys to find out and him be a bust in the second week of the fantasy playoffs for you guys. So I'm going to avoid Calvin Austin. I'm not touching Mike Williams. I'm not touching Ben Schoernick or Van Jefferson or anybody else here. Let's just stay away. It's George Pickens or nothing for me. Zay Flowers had a nice day this past week, 11.3 fantasy points, 7 targets, 6 catches, 53 receiving yards. I think Zay Flowers is always startable. He's had a solid season. Nothing crazy. We haven't really seen those high upside games that we were getting like weeks 5 through 9 on the season in quite some time. I think he's startable. It's not a great matchup. It kind of depends on who else you've got, but 11, 10, 12 fantasy points will probably happen this week for sure. Rashad Bateman, a really big day in week 15, 2 receiving touchdowns, 5 targets, 3 catches, 80 receiving yards, 23 fantasy points. So he had a dud in week 13, a little bit banged up in that game, but you take that away, he's had double digits in 3 of his last 5. So, Bateman is a flexible option, a desperation flex, a deeper league option, but that's about it. He, of course, is going to bring some volatility. Now, I've got Deontay Johnson and Nelson Aguilar on the screen. Aguilar did nothing this past week. Deontay Johnson is not even going to play this week. Devontae Walker had his first catch, his first touchdown of his rookie season. He's a player to watch. I liked him a lot coming out of college, but probably nothing here when it comes down to the wire here in the last couple weeks of the fantasy season. But he did have a touchdown grab this past week, and Tylan Wallace also had a catch. But wrapping it up, Zay Flowers, startable. Bateman, flex option. Pickens, let's cross our fingers he plays in Week 16. Next up, we have the Giants moving into Sunday's action, traveling to face the Falcons. Let's start with the Giants. Told you guys going into Week 15, I was fine with Malik Neighbors, not going to panic about the quarterback situation. He's been coming through with double-digit performances regardless of who's playing quarterback. And actually, it turns out that Tim Boyle might be the best option at quarterback for Malik Neighbors. He had his first touchdown since Week 3 of the season, 24.2 fantasy points, 14 targets, 10 grabs, 82 receiving yards. It's another smash matchup this week against the Falcons secondary. It's a good matchup in Week 17 against the Colts. So if you own Neighbors, just keep rolling with them. The floor is there, and it was nice to see some upside this past week as well. In terms of anybody else here, Rondell Robinson, Darius Slayton, Jalen Hyatt, whoever it is, there's just not enough here from a fantasy perspective. Robinson, one of these guys, if you're 100% desperate, you can always throw in and you might get 6, 7, or 8 points, but I'm not banking on more than that. Now, as a reminder, I have to record these videos before Monday Night Football, so if there's any major injury to a Falcons wide receiver or something that changes my mind here, then I'll let you guys know in the comment section down below. But I think Drake London will be a solid start in Week 16. Don't know if the touchdown upside will be there the way Kirk Cousins has been playing as of late. Maybe that changes on Monday Night Football, but nonetheless, London, startable, top 20 wide receiver in fantasy, has single digits, excluding Week 15, just 3 times on the season, so still very startable. Darnell Mooney's also a top 20 wide receiver in fantasy football, had a nice week in Week 14. We'll see what happens in Week 15. He's always flexible, volatile. You know, you're playing with fire, you throw him into your lineup, maybe it happens. Maybe it doesn't. It's basically a high or low with Mooney, right? And Ray McLeod has had some nice performances in the last couple weeks. See how he does in Week 15. He may end up being a desperation play in Week 16, but I'm not going to call him anything more than that. And for majority of you guys, will probably just be a sit going into Week 16. Along, we have the Patriots traveling to face the Bills. Let's start with the Patriots. I'm just sitting everybody. I mean, it's been weeks now that this has been my case, and my only argument has been if you're desperate, you can throw Demario Douglas out there as a desperation flex option. He did score his first touchdown since Week 6 this past week, but even with scoring a touchdown, Demario Douglas gave us that reliable 10.1 fantasy stat line, and that's usually how I feel about Douglas. He'll probably get you like 10 points if you're desperate. The Bills secondary is a little bit banged up. They've been playing pretty god-awful the past 2 weeks, so sure, if you're desperate, you can throw Douglas out there, but, you know, Kendrick Bourne, Kayshon Boutte, just any of these guys, Jalen Polk, I'm just staying away here. Just nothing from a fantasy perspective in terms of consistency on the season. Looking at the Bills, the one wide receiver who I continue to trust is Khalil Shakir. 15.9 fantasy points, 7 targets, 6 grabs, a touchdown, 39 receiving yards against the Lions. It'll be interesting to see who Christian Gonzalez lines up here or against here in Week 16. He is a very good young corner for the Patriots, but Shakir mainly out of the slot. I would imagine Gonzalez would be on Amari Cooper. We'll find out. Nonetheless, I'm still good with starting Shakir this week. I think he continues to be one of the most reliable, best options that you can roll out there, right? Amari Cooper went from 15.5 fantasy points to 0 fantasy points, so I'm done. Not touching him with a 10-foot pole, way too risky. Keon Coleman had 1 catch for 64 receiving yards. Way too risky. Anybody else here? Curtis Samuel got hurt this past week, and Mac Hollins came back to earth after having 2 touchdowns in 2 straight weeks with 1.7 fantasy points. So rest my case, Khalil Shakir, that's it. And yeah, I just don't want to touch the Patriots wide receivers. Way too risky here in the second round of the playoffs. Let's move along to the Cardinals, who are traveling to face the Panthers. Let's start with the Cardinals. Said it last week. I can't call Marvin Harrison Jr. anything more than a flex, and That's all he is. What are we going to get out of the Cardinals on a weekly basis? I mean, James Conner is probably going to run the football a lot. And outside of that, there's just no consistency other than Trey McBride is going to have, 11 targets, 9 catches, 86 receiving yards, and 0 touchdowns, right? Trey McBride is going to get a lot of targets and receptions. James Conner is going to look good running the football. That's it. I don't know what we're going to get out of Kyler Murray on a weekly basis. I don't know what this pass attack brings on a weekly basis. It's been super frustrating owning Marvin Harrison Jr. if you do own him. The Panthers have not been that bad against opposing wide receivers. I'm just staying away unless you're desperate and you have to throw him into your flex, and that is it. Greg Dortch, Michael Wilson, there's just nothing here. Wilson has had a couple okay games as of late. This past week he did not. So Marvin Harrison Jr. is flexible, and that's it. Moving along to the Panthers. Adam Thielen is still flexible. This is a good enough matchup, but came kind of back to earth in a good matchup this past week. Still had 10 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 grabs, 51 receiving yards, but we saw more involvement out of Jalen Coker, who had 6 targets, 4 catches, 110 receiving yards, a touchdown, and 21 fantasy points. And on top of all that, Xavier Legette is dealing with a groin injury, and he's likely not going to play this week. So that would leave David Moore as the next man up, who did nothing, had 2 catches this past week. So I do think Thielen will be fine this week, but we had seen a pretty nice ceiling, 19.2 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. Maybe tamper your expectations because it looks like Bryce Young has a good chemistry with Coker. But like I said, Legette's going to miss some time here, so that could impact Thielen in a positive way. So not scared of this Cardinals defense right now. Panthers wide receivers have another good matchup in Week 17 against the Bucs. So Thielen and Coker, I think, are flexible, but we're going to want to continue to kind of see how this volume between the two shapes out. Next up, we have the Lions traveling to face the Bears. Let's start with Amon-Ra St. Brown. If you ever needed a reminder of why you start your studs, of why you start your first round draft picks, always Amon-Ra St. Brown reminded you in Week 15 after 12.3 or less fantasy points in 3 straight games and no touchdowns in 3 straight games. People started looking at these matchups. He gets Buffalo, he gets Chicago, he gets San Francisco. Do I want to start him through the fantasy playoffs? The answer is always yes with a player like Amon-Ra St. Brown, who had 37.3 fantasy points this past week, 18 targets, 14 catches, 193 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Now, the Bills secondary has been banged up as of late, and they've been playing really bad the past 2 weeks. The game script benefited Amon-Ra St. Brown as the Lions were in a position where they had to throw the football. It was a career game, literally the best of his entire career, 193 receiving yards. But yes, I'm still starting Amon-Ra St. Brown this week against the Bears. I know it's a tough matchup here, but I'm going to try and not freak out about it. He should still have a good floor. The last time he played the Bears in Week 13, he still had 12.3 fantasy points. So all I'm going to say is you own Amon-Ra St. Brown. Don't bench him. Jameson Williams had another solid game, 12.7 fantasy points, just 3 catches off of 5 targets, but 37 receiving yards and a touchdown kind of late in the game. But hey, you own Jameson Williams. He kind of lives atop of the flex area, boomer bust guy, but lately been a little bit more of like a floor guy, 11.8 fantasy points, 9.6, 13, 12.7. Those are his last 4 starts. So, you own Jameson Williams. I think he's a solid flex. We'll leave it at that. Got Tim Patrick as a sit. If you're in a deep enough format, you're in a desperate enough situation. He's intriguing with 13 or more fantasy points in his last 2 games and 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games. We got the David Montgomery injury now. Maybe we see more volume go to somebody here. Tim Patrick's interesting, but a majority of you guys, you don't need to go that far. Definitely keep an eye on him, though. DJ Moore, moving along to the Bears. As a reminder, I got to record these before Monday Night Football, so any major injuries, anything that changes my mind, let you guys know in the pinned comment down below. But, the Vikings, not a great secondary. The Lions, not a great secondary here in Week 16. So basically how I feel about these Bears wide receivers, as long as everyone's healthy, is that DJ Moore is a solid start. And then you got 2 flexible guys who have volatility on a weekly basis in Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze. Good matchup this week against the Lions, who that defense and now offense continues to just deal with more injuries. So I think that the Bears wide receivers will bring some nice upside in week 16. Next up, we have the Titans traveling to face the Colts, and this got to be maybe my least favorite matchup of the whole video, but Calvin Ridley is flexible, and I mean that's it. That's it. Who's going to be the quarterback? Will Levis, Mason Rudolph? I just don't know. The Titans at the time of recording this haven't named a starter, so yeah, I don't know, and I don't know what to expect out of this offense as a whole in terms of their passing attack. Great matchup this past week, and all Ridley got us was 9 fantasy points. I'm moving him down to the flex category from the start category. He gets 2 good matchups this week against the Colts, week 17 against the Jags. You play through week 18 against Texans, so like the matchups are there, but come on, the production hasn't been there. Nick Westbrook-Akine, I thought maybe could bounce back this past week against the Bengals defense, and no, he didn't. 2 catches, 2.9 fantasy points. Tyler Boyd, 5.9 fantasy points. Let's just avoid everyone here unless you're desperate and you got to throw Ridley into a flex type situation. The Colts wide receivers, equally as frustrating. I hope you didn't start any of them this past week, but Josh Downs, just 6.2 fantasy points. Michael Pittman, 9.8 fantasy points. Alec Pierce has a concussion, or at least a hit injury. A.D. Mitchell, -3 fantasy points this past week. So I'm just done. I'm staying away from all the Colts wide receivers. Had them all as sits this past week. It is a okay matchup, or at least a better matchup compared to this past week against the Broncos. But I mean, Anthony Richardson was 17 of 38, 172 passing yards, 2 interceptions, and had 46 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. So, like, I just don't know what I don't know what this offense is anymore, and I want nothing to do with it from a fantasy perspective from the wide receiver position. So I'm setting all the Colts wide receivers in week 16. Along, we have the Rams, who are traveling to face the Jets. Okay, this one's going to anger somebody. I'm still trusting Cooper Kupp in week 16. I get it, guys. 3 targets, 0 catches. His only career game with no catches. Let's just look past it. And this Jets defense does not scare me. They rank pretty well against wide receivers. They have on the season, but they don't scare me, just point blank period. And I'm going to start Cooper Kupp this week if I own him. I believe in just moving along to the next week. He's still outside of this past week, only has 1 other start on the season. That it was a full game where he had single digits. And since week 8, has 15 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2. And the Rams will not take their foot off the gas. They're trying to secure as many wins as possible and trying to win that division by the time the season wraps up. So I'm starting Kupp. I'm leaving it at that. I'm also starting Puka Nacua, who was fine this past week and one of the only bright spots in that Niners-Rams game. Had 17.8 fantasy points, 8 targets, 7 catches, 97 receiving yards. He has had 17.3 or more fantasy points in every game since week 8, except for his Mike Tyson game in week 9, where he got ejected, right? So I'll continue to roll with Kupp and Puka Nacua. There's not any other Rams wide receivers that we need to go over or talk about going into week 16. Everyone else is a sit. Now, the Jets wide receivers, I've been balling out. If you own Devontae Adams, you probably advanced to the next round of the playoffs here in week 16. He had 42.8 fantasy points, 12 targets, 9 catches, 198 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. Yeah, a lot of it happened in the fourth quarter, but he was still pretty solid outside of that. And Garrett Wilson had 14.6 fantasy points off of just 3 catches for 56 receiving yards and a touchdown, 6 targets for Garrett Wilson, who is a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy football. Devontae Adams is a top 15 fantasy football, or wide receiver in fantasy football. I'm sorry. So, yeah, and the target share to Adams has been crazy as of late. So, no way I'm benching him. And it's really just these 2 guys when you break down the target share. But you got to keep rolling with both of them. I know Allen Lazard is technically playing, but he hasn't done anything. Xavier Gipson's not doing anything. Malachi Corley's been hurt. It's just these 2 guys. Tyler Conklin didn't play this past week because him and his wife had a baby. Congrats. Breece Hall had 2 targets, 2 catches. So it's basically all Adams with the sprinkle of Wilson. And I think they can get it done against the Rams this week. I don't know exactly what they're playing for. I guess for Aaron Rodgers' pride. They're not going to the playoffs, but hey, they're probably going to come through and help you guys make it to the next round of the fantasy playoffs. Moving along, we have the Eagles traveling to face the Commanders. And another good reminder why you always start your first, second round guys and you trust your studs. A.J. Brown. Got way too many questions this past week about A.J. Brown. And as I always do this time of year, I tell you guys, trust your gut. Don't let me be the final decider what you do with your roster. But if I own A.J. Brown, I'm not benching him, right? 25 fantasy points in Week 15 and a tough matchup against the Steelers. Joey Porter Jr., all that stuff. Him and Jalen Hurts hate each other and blah, 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 blah. 11 targets, 8 grabs, 110 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Don't bench A.J. Brown. End of story. Devonta Smith, another guy I encourage you guys to keep rolling with. 28 fantasy points in Week 15, 12 targets, 11 catches, 109 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith belong in your starting lineups, and that is the end of the story. Terry McLaurin, on the other hand, is having himself a heck of a season. Top 5 wide receiver in fantasy football, 26.3 fantasy points against the Saints, 10 targets, 7 receptions, 73 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. He has 5 touchdowns in his last 3 games. Tough matchup this week. I don't really care. I'm going to keep rolling with him. But it is worth noting the last time he played the Eagles, he had just 2 fantasy points. But this is an important game here for both teams in terms of playoff implications. It's a home game for the Commanders. I have a very tough time benching Terry McLaurin. In terms of any other wide receiver on this team, there's just not enough for me. I don't think Noah Brown's healthy, but he's on the screen for you guys. But yeah, there's just not enough here for any other Commanders wide receiver. So it's Terry McLaurin or nobody. When it comes to that Eagles offense, it's A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith. Nobody else in terms of wide receivers in Week 16. Next up, we got the Browns, who will be traveling to Cincinnati to face the Bengals to hopefully try and ruin their playoff hopes and dreams, as the Bengals have to win every single game on the season left. But let's start with the Browns. Now, Jerry Jeudy had another monster week in Week 15 because why not? 21.8 fantasy points, 14 targets, 11 catches, 108 receiving yards, but what it's really going to come down to here in terms of your confidence level with Jerry Jeudy in Week 16 is, does Jameis Winston get benched or not? 3 interceptions, a fumble, 146 passing yards, no touchdowns for Jameis in Week 15. Better matchup this week against the Bengals, but there are rumors that DTR may get the start as he came in relief of Jameis Winston once Jameis Winston was benched against the Chiefs, but he wasn't much better. He also threw a pick, so I don't know who's going to start here. But if it is Winston, then the Jerry Jeudy, Jameis Winston connection will stay alive, and Jeudy is a must start due to the matchup and due to the production that we've seen out of him since Winston has been the quarterback. So you own Jeudy. Let's pay attention to what happens at quarterback here, but he's probably going to be a start for you guys. And once again, Elijah Moore, Cedric Tillman, they rely on the health of Jameis Winston, and in Cedric Tillman's case, his own health as well, as he's been dealing with concussion, has missed 3 weeks. But if they play, they're flexible due to the matchup if Jameis Winston's the starting quarterback, because we know he's going to go out there and sling it. So, yeah, we'll just have to see what happens with the Browns as the week progresses. I will say Elijah Moore, Cedric Tillman, if he plays, not my favorite flex options this week, but they are flexible if Winston's out there. Jeudy, 100% startable. Should be a start in your lineup if Winston plays. Jamar Chase, T. Higgins continue to also be absolute must-start players. Jamar Chase, 18.4 fantasy points this past week. I know some people were worried about Higgins. You just can't be. 19.8 fantasy points this past week. Both were great. Bengals, like I said, they got to win every single game. They're going to do whatever they can to win this home game against the Browns, and they should win this game. they are a better team, right? And the Browns defense has been struggling as of late. They're okay this past week in a rainy game against the Chiefs, but the secondary's been really bad on the season. So, big game for the Bengals. They got to win it. They're going to sling it. Joe Burrow's going to look great. Chase going to look great. Higgins going to look great. Start those guys. Set anybody else on this team. It should be a fun one. We'll see what happens in Week 16. And speaking of the Bengals needing to win every single game to wrap up the season and not taking their foot off the gas, I am taking Jamar Chase's over on receiving yards on Underdog, currently sitting at 88.5 receiving yards. He has hit this line in 3 of his last 5 games. In his last 2 games, and I just don't see any world where the Cleveland Browns secondary is going to slow down Jamar Chase. So I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Chase's total receiving yards. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, will get a free NFL Pick Em to use towards Week 16's action. Take your free pick 'em. Take the over on Chase's receiving yards. Once both those lines hit, you'll automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, when you guys sign up on Underdog using promo code TheCatch, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL pick 'em to use towards Week 16's action and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up using promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. Moving along, let's take a look at the Vikings traveling to face the Seahawks. Reminder, I got to record these on Monday before Monday Night Football has been played, but I'm not very worried about Justin Jefferson, even if he has a rough game against the Bears. The last time they played, he had 4.7 fantasy points, but yeah, as a reminder, you always start your studs, right? And yeah, I'm rolling with Justin Jefferson if I own him. No matter what, 32.2 fantasy points in Week 14. See what happens on Monday Night Football with JJ, but if I own him, I'm starting him. I'm not thinking twice about it. Jordan Addison, a little bit volatile over the past couple of weeks. We'll see what he does against the Bears as well. Last time he played the Bears, he had 30 fantasy points, and that's kind of the thing. Like, he still might kind of be considered a flex option for me because we've seen some ups and downs, but he's moved into the top 20 in terms of wide receivers. He has 30 or more fantasy points in 2 games, excluding Week 15, since Week 12. He's been pretty dang good, so it's hard to call him anything less than a start. And the Seahawks defense doesn't really scare me right now, so I will roll with JJ and Addison. Anybody else here, Jalen Naylor, and anyone who's left, just not going to be a option fantasy-wise. Looking at the Seahawks, we probably need to put an asterisk here because Geno Smith may or may not play this week, although the Seahawks, the initial reports are positive around the Geno Smith injury. But if Sam Howell's the guy, I don't quite know that I feel too confident in the Seahawks wide receivers, but at the same time, very difficult to bench Jackson Smith and Jigba right now, who has double digits in every game except for 1 since Week 4. Double digits in every game on the season except for 3. 18.3 fantasy points this past week, 12 targets, 10 catches, 83 receiving yards. Minnesota's secondary has not been great on the season. So I'll probably start in JSN no matter what, but your confidence level may lower if Sam Howell's a quarterback. Now, DK Metcalf's just a flex. And he's a risky flex. 8.9 or less fantasy points in 2 straight games. 9.9 or less in 3 of his last 4. I mean, he plays a role in this offense, but that role is opening things up a lot more for JSN. I just don't know if you guys want to risk it going into the week in the most important matchup of your season yet. But it is a good matchup against the Vikings for what it's worth. But 3 catches, 3 off of 3 targets, 28 receiving yards this past week. I'm a bit worried about DK Metcalf, and we have been a bit worried for a few weeks. Tyler Lockett had 1 catch. I'm sitting Tyler Lockett in Week 16, so we'll see what happens. This could be definitely an interesting matchup with a lot of upside in Week 16. Next up, we have the Jaguars, who will be traveling to face the Raiders, and let's start with Brian Thomas Jr., who has just turned out to be one of these guys this year who every single week I've said, start Brian Thomas Jr. He's just lived in that category for me. And like we had the 2 down weeks in weeks 9 and 10, and bad game in week 6, bad game in week 3, but that's just 4 games on the season where he hasn't gotten you double digits, and you just end up being one of those guys that I've said keep rolling with the punches no matter what, and you were happy if you did in week 15. 32.5 fantasy points, 14 targets, 10 grabs, 105 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. And the best part about that was he did it with Mac Jones at quarterback. So I'd continue to roll Brian Thomas Jr., take the punches. I don't know if this week's going to have, as high of a ceiling, because the Raiders have not been that bad against opposing wide receivers, believe it or not. But B-Tom's been great in his rookie season. Hasn't really mattered about the quarterback play, so keep rolling with them. Anybody else here? Parker Washington, Josh Reynolds, Devin Duvernay, whoever it may be, I'm just staying away from. There's no fantasy relevancy here. Now, Jacoby Myers I had as a flex, but we kind of got the last minute news here that Aiden O'Connell is not playing in week 15. So I do think that his ceiling will be potentially lower, even a good matchup against the Falcons in week 15. And then it's a good matchup this week against the Jags, and the following week it's a good matchup against the Saints. So flexible, but maybe his ceiling is lower due to the quarterback play. We'll have to wait and find out, but he's been pretty dang solid on the season for the most part. Just don't know how high his ceiling is and his upside is, so we'll find out. Trey Tucker, DJ Turner, not enough here for me, even though it's a good matchup in week 16. Moving along, we have the Niners traveling to face the Dolphins. And Jawan Jennings was a total dud in week 15. 9 targets, 2 grabs, 31 receiving yards, 5.1 fantasy points. Brock Purdy had a bad game. Debo was god-awful. Luckily, we had Debo as a sit this past week. Ricky Pearsall has essentially done nothing for weeks. So, yeah, it's a tough matchup against the Dolphins. For the most part on the season, the secondary has been pretty dang good. So, Jennings, flexible. And that's it. Risky flex. Leave it at that. He has single digits in 3 of his last 4. Now, like one of those games, you got Brandon Allen at quarterback. The next game was in the snow. Week 14 was fantastic. Then he had this past week. So it's all over the place here. Risky flex. That's it. Debo's out of it. You can draw. I've said it last week. You can cut Debo. If you don't have the confidence to start Debo, he's just a roster clogger. Take a chance on someone on the waivers. Just cut Debo. Move along. If he has another good game on the season, so be it. But if you're not even going to start him, then just move along. Tyreek Hill, 5.6 fantasy points this past week. He gets downgraded to the flex area. The Niners have still been pretty good against wide receivers on the season. I think Hill can bounce back. I was really surprised that he struggled against the Texans. I love this matchup on paper. I love the game script, everything about it, and it just did not happen. And then, of course, Jalen Waddle, fortunately, avoided a major knee injury, but he's still day-to-day and could very well miss this week. He's downgraded to the flex as well. I thought he was going to have a huge game against the Texans. Obviously, we didn't get to see, and he got hurt, but we'll just have to see what happens with Waddle. Him and Hill are flexible this week. Malik Washington, I have as a sit, but he definitely benefited from the Waddle injury. 6 targets, 5 catches, 52 receiving yards, 10.2 fantasy points. Maybe he's a guy if and only if Waddle doesn't play this week, but only a desperation play if Waddle's out in week 16. Next up, we have the Buccaneers, who are traveling to face the Cowboys on Sunday Night Football. Let's start with Mike Evans, the GOAT himself, 36.9 whopping fantasy points in Week 15 against the Chargers. 11 targets, 9 grabs, 159 receiving yards, and 2 tutties. He has double digits in every game since he returned from that hamstring injury. You're starting Mike Evans if you own him, okay? Point blank, period. And you know the Bucs are going to try and get him to that 1,000-yard mark on the season, and he's just on pace to do so. And this Bucs offense, this Bucs team, they're doing whatever they possibly can to win every single game and make sure they win the NFC South this year. So they're not going to take their foot off the gas. It's going to be a good day for the Bucs. Now, we talked about Jalen McMillan this past week, and it's one of our top waiver options, but I told you guys be careful. Maybe we're chasing points, but he got very well involved in Week 15's matchup. 18.5 fantasy points, 6 targets, 5 grabs, 75 receiving yards, and a tutty. Good matchup against the Cowboys this week. McMillan makes the flex category. Just depends on who you've got, who you're starting him over, all that stuff. But I do think he's flexible here in week 16. Sterling Shepard, going to be a sit for me. He had a decent week 14, then just 2.6 points this past week. So let's stay away from Shepard. But Evans and McMillan, definitely startable this week, especially Evans, of course. And of course, CeeDee Lamb is also very startable. And the best thing about CeeDee Lamb, if you're a CeeDee Lamb owner, right, is he's had like 3 injuries over the past couple of weeks. He has a shoulder injury. He's playing through a legit shoulder injury. He already got paid. He already has the guaranteed money. And he's showing up for this crappy Dallas Cowboys team and is still playing his heart out. Had a huge week 15, 26.6 fantasy points, 13 targets, 9 grabs, 116 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Had 21.4 points the week before, all with Cooper Rush at quarterback. And this Buccaneers secondary is atrocious. So if you own CeeDee Lamb, keep rolling with CeeDee Lamb. Brandon Cooks, I left in the flex category. He's 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games. Very risky flex. But the matchups here, you guys know that I like wide receivers going up against this Buccaneers secondary. So I think he is flexible in a desperate situation. Jalen Tolbert did have a touchdown this past week, but that was his only catch. Kevontae Turpin at 2.7 fantasy points. They're too risky for me. So Cooks, maybe. Lamb, yes. McMillan, stronger maybe. Evans, yes, in week 16. And last but not least, we have the Saints, who will travel to face the Packers in what could be a one-sided affair, but I said that this past week, and the Saints found a way to keep it close with the Commanders with the help of the refs, but nonetheless, MVS just a sit for me. 8.8 fantasy points this past week was honestly about as good of a circumstance as I think you could get with Jake Hayner and Spencer Rattler at quarterback. And now Kamara is banged up. Maybe a receiver gets more involved here, but I mean, come on. Cedric Wilson, Kevin Austin, Mason Tipton, Dante Pettis, and half these guys are hurt anyways. And it's just, no. Just stay away from everybody here. This could be a huge day for the Packers defense this week. There's nothing here when it comes to these wide receivers for the Saints. The Packers wide receivers had them all as flexes this past week, and I had them all as flexes again this week. Jaden Reed had 11.1 fantasy points, much better than his goose egg in week 14. 6 targets, 5 grabs, 34 receiving yards. Good matchup this week. Packers are at home, but they're also going up against a very bad run defense in the Saints, so could be a 3-touchdown day for Josh Jacobs. He's due for one of those. It's been a whole week since he's done that, right? Romeo Doubs, I will say, I mean, if he's out there on the waiver, he's totally worth picking up. Now, just keep in mind, any of these Packers wide receivers, there's never consistency. So Doubs comes out after being out for 2 weeks with a concussion, has 19 fantasy points, 5 targets, just 3 catches, but 2 of them were touchdowns and 40 receiving yards. So be careful chasing points when it comes to the Packers wide receivers, but Doubs is flexible. Then Watson got some involvement. Nice week in week 14. Just 8.6 fantasy points this past week, but 6 targets, 3 grabs, 56 receiving yards. I mean, they all get their involvement. It's never consistent. Tavion Wicks caught 2 passes this past week, if you're curious, and Bo Milton has now taken a step back. But yeah, that's what it is every week. You can flex the Packers wide receivers. They're volatile. They're risky. They have upside. They're boom or bust. And Josh Jacobs is probably going to have a big day here in week 16. So you're playing with fire, but the Packers wide receivers are still startable as we start to wrap up the fantasy season. That'll do it for today's video. There's every single matchup, every single wide receiver, and who you should be starting or sitting as we move into week 16 of the season and the second round of the 2024 fantasy football playoffs. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions in the comment section down below as I possibly can. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into the week, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I can throughout the week. But most importantly, make sure that you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content, because we're going to have everything you guys can need through the rest of the fantasy season to help you guys bring home a championship here in the 2024 fantasy football season. So be sure that you are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the videos. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.